Hello, everyone. In this video lecture, we're going to take a look at the second chapter of the section of the novel entitled Audrey the Biographer. Remember what I've said in previous lectures, that this section of the novel, and in fact the novel as an entirety, as a whole, is very much focused on the constructedness of identity, how we go back into our pasts and construct who we are or manufacture an identity for ourselves and the people around us by artificially identifying those key defining moments that make a person who they are. Audrey's been grappling with the question of whether or not she truly knows her father. Who knows her father in those previous couple of chapters that ended off the last section, as we discussed in our interactive class last week? Here, that issue becomes the driving force behind her exploration of biography, the way in which she is framing her own identity and that of her father and those around her, and constructing them progressively. So, those themes of memory and identity, grief and loss, and the ability or the effort to reclaim that person who has gone, to wrest them from death, from oblivion, and to tell the story of their lives so that they can live on, are all intermingling here in this section of the novel. This chapter features a traumatic memory and the indelible marks that are left on Audrey's psyche as a result of this near plane crash. Audrey has been trying to control the story of this novel. She's been using her games of language, telling stories, embracing stories, in order to reconstruct her own identity and that of her father, at least on the subconscious psychological level. Here, she loses control of the story because she loses control of her own mind. After all, it's memory that allows her to give shape and meaning to those lives. It's memory that lets her select those individual moments that matter and align them in a biography, quote unquote, to construct the identities of the people that she cares about. Here, she's lost to memory. The memory, instead of being the object of her control, something that she deploys, is in fact a traumatic one that stays with her despite her efforts to forget it. It's the one that's been seared or marred on her. She doesn't have control of it. She's at the mercy of it. One of the reasons that we can understand that Audrey is trying to control the story of her life, to write the story of her life in a way, is that in this moment, that effort on a symbolic level becomes manifest. It becomes literalized. She tries to prevent this plane from crashing. She tries to control the unfolding story around her by writing. Just as she's written most of the story up until this point, all of her games of language, all of her wordplay, all of these things are a representation of how she tries to control that story. And here she does so again by writing a note to the plane. After a while, she says on page 162, my hollow left arm ride seemed intentional and designed especially for me. So she sees some random, commonplace convenience, the armrests, and she ascribes meaning to it, that there must be a purpose to all these signs and symbols that she sees around her. I liked the rectangle of darkness inside. It was a secret compartment, and I loved secret compartments. On page 165, as the plane is circling over and over again in this meandering spiral of futile motion, she says on page 165, in an effort to prevent the plane from falling, in essence to convince it not to fall, she writes a note to it. I decide to add a secret message to my map. I would leave a secret message in the armrest. Then the plane would not crash, because a plane carrying a message in its armrest could not crash. Rule number 1 of secret messages and armrests. So she writes this message to try to beg the plane not to crash. We see what that message was on page 334. We have a depiction of both the message that she leaves to the plane and the response that's granted to her by Wilfred Moss, the man who becomes Uncle Toby. So on page 334, we have this little illustration of Wednesday Pond, or 3 Wednesday Place, in front of Wednesday Pond, and Audrey's, or the child Audrey's message, Dear plane, do not crash, I love you, Audrey Flowers. P.S. Send a message back. Then on the next page, we see a response letter from Audrey's father, Walter, to a man named Wilfred Moss. Now, Wilfred Moss was that baggage handler in England who has sent a letter claiming to be the plane to the young child Audrey to tell her, it's all right, I got your message, thank you very much. You were never in any danger. The plane wasn't in any danger of falling. So unwittingly, Walter Flowers and his partner were introduced to each other by Audrey, unwittingly, even though she didn't mean to control the evolution of the story in this way, she did. Her intention was to prevent the plane from crashing in this ridiculous moment, but she lost control even of that. Even as she influenced and controlled the story, it wasn't intentional. It was completely unintentional. So Wilfred Moss here receives a letter from Walter Flowers. Dear Mr. Moss, you understand why I might intercept a letter to my daughter from the plane. What message are you referring to? So he doesn't know that this message was left behind in the plane. And he's asking a question, who the heck are you and why are you sending a letter to my daughter? What message are you referring to? No doubt you're well-intentioned. I am sorry for your circumstances. What I infer are your circumstances. What are your circumstances? What an odd missive. Are you describing some form of hemihypertrophy? Forgive a protective father and please explain, Walter Flowers. So we know that this is Uncle Toby because he references hemihypertrophy. And that's actually the condition that Uncle Toby, or Wilfred Moss, suffers from. Audrey is, of course, unaware of that, and she doesn't understand the message that she receives here as an adult, or the letter that she finds. But Audrey has unwittingly orchestrated the romance plot of this novel. What we have here is an illustration of Audrey's impotence, her inability to actually understand and deploy her language and her storytelling in a conscious and meaningful fashion. The success that she achieves is entirely accidental and incidental to her purposes. It brings about, as Uncle Toby puts it on page 268, the great safe adventure that he has embarked upon to Canada, which consists of you, Audrey, and your dad. This, he says, is my great safe adventure. In this chapter, we also have a further explanation of the reason that Walter has tried to convince his daughter that Wedge, this mouse that's supposed to be only able to live 2 years, has in fact gained a kind of immortality. He comforts her with the lie of its immortality. The reason for that, as we learn on page 167, is that only a few weeks after this plane crash, Audrey, still traumatized, terrified about, well, death, the death that nearly befell her, is allowed to take Wedge home. So on page 167, a few weeks later, we brought Wedge home from the lab. My dad could not say no to me wanting to keep Wedge alive forever. She has here a sympathetic identification with Wedge. As Verlaine points out later on in the novel, Audrey doesn't love animals, really. She loves pieces of herself. Wedge, Winifred, Rambo, all the animals here, in fact all the people, become objects onto whom Audrey can project her own experience. So by saving Wedge's life and by giving him euthanasia, in her words, by making him immortal, Audrey is in some sense able to psychologically neutralize the terror of her own death, or the inevitability of her death, the terror that she experienced. It's a coping mechanism and a means of her recovery. Her father recognizes that and allows her to save Wedge's life as a way of grappling with her own terror and suppressing it. However, as we see in that one chapter from much later on in the novel that I asked you to read, from pages 267 to 275, that process is fundamentally destructive. It's deleterious to the psychological well-being of Audrey. And in fact, it renders life a pointless, meandering, meaningless excursion through the ebb. In this chapter, in the intervening period between the section of the novel that you've read and this chapter, Wedge goes missing. And we're meant to understand that Wedge, the last Wedge, has actually died. He escaped confinement and hid somewhere inside the house to die because he felt his death was approaching. In parallel, Uncle Toby has also departed without leaving a message for Audrey. He's gone back to England because he can't stand to live there any longer. He can't stand the pain of being reminded of his loss by living in that home. His experience is in fact much the same as Audrey's. As a result of these further losses, Audrey is forced to reconsider the nature of her identity and her association with the people around her. On page 272, Audrey is convinced that there is some villain, some enemy that she can fight and that she can protect the people around her from, or from whom she can protect the people around her. And she invents this adversary of Lionel de Tigrel, her father's professional adversary, that man for whom he didn't really care. And she says that Lionel de Tigrel probably stole Wedge to learn the secrets of my father's research. Verlaine insists that's not the case, and she tries to guide Audrey to a more adult and mature understanding of the situation. For a moment, Verlaine seems to be entering into the spirit of the thing. Then she gets a balloon bursting look. Audrey. What? She hesitates. The average lifespan of a mouse. I rock in my chair. I know. Do you? 4 years, I say. Try 2. That's a far cry from 20. You're telling me... Rock. What is she getting at? That Wedge is not Wedge? That Wedge could not be Wedge? That is what she's getting at. Does she think I wouldn't know my own mouse? Having nursed him back to health after a near drowning in a Canadian Tire garbage can and lived cheek by jowl with him for all or most of my life, that would be like Verlaine not knowing Rambo from, I don't know, Sylvester Stallone. So Verlaine is trying to illuminate the situation for Audrey and to guide her to understanding that Audrey really doesn't have any understanding of the identities of the people around her. Wedge is not Wedge. Uncle Toby is not Uncle Toby. The man that she remembers as her father is very much different from the man that he actually was because he was lying to her to protect her continually. Much of this novel is really about her coming to terms with the reality of these people's identities and growing to the point as a person that she's able to do so. And Wedge becomes a kind of proxy or substitute for her experience of loss and terror, and also her growing understanding of who Uncle Toby actually is. Not her uncle, but the only father that she has left. The culminating moment in this chapter represents a reflection on the necessity of death that brings meaning to life. Audrey begins to think about the difference between a tortoise and a horse's and a mouse's heartbeats. And she says on page 274 that my dad said that my heartbeats were like whole notes to Wedge's eighth notes, a kind of music. I didn't understand. He said, think of it this way. Wedge's heart fills in the gaps in yours. I like that idea. Then there are other animals with very slow hearts, he said. Like? Tortoises. Tortoises. My dad said that in London he once went to a performance of Ode to Joy, slowed down to last 24 hours. Ode to Slow Motion. That is like a tortoise, he said. What did that sound like? Like a planet rotating. All I'm saying is that Wedge could run 20 kilometers a day on a 2 centimeter long legs. He was fit. He could light a light bulb, for Christ's sakes. It occurred to me, at some point, that the slower your beats per minute, the longer you could put off your last heartbeat. The irony was that whenever I thought of my last heartbeat, or the last heartbeat of anyone I loved, my beats per minute, my heartbeat, increased. My dad asked where I had heard about such a thing as a last heartbeat. I don't know, I made it up. He said, assume your last heartbeat can be put off indefinitely. So he tries to comfort her again. Assume that life can go on forever. Assume that there is no last heartbeat, that you can put it off or you can delay it eternally. Think about what that implies about the meaninglessness of a life that is immortal. The ebb is that path that becomes less a path the further along it we travel. We've noticed it at numerous points throughout the novel, the metaphor of heartbeats and life. That place of confusion, of misery, loss, grief, ambiguity, uncertainty, of never having meaning or purpose in one's path or in one's experience. If you can put off the last heartbeat forever, it means that you're extending the distance between each of those heartbeats, extending the music or the blank space between the notes of music of your heartbeat, to carry through this metaphor of Wedge's heartbeats and Audrey's and Winifred's. In other words, you're traveling through that blank, meaningless absence of the ebb, the chaos and confusion of the ebb, forever, because the space between each heartbeat becomes infinitely large to put off indefinitely the last heartbeat. Metaphorically, using the combination of the ebb, the last heartbeat, and the spaces between heartbeats, the novel is telling us at this moment that the immortal life is not even a life at all. It's just meaningless, subsistent existence without purpose, because there is no end. There is no story because the story keeps on going forever. A story needs a beginning, middle, and end, just like a meaningful life. Coming to terms with the reality and the inevitability of death is one of Audrey's great challenges. But the novel posits to us that the great reality of our lives is that death is necessary so that we can escape the meaningless, ambling progression of our own lives, and that meaning can be ascribed to it, offered to it, that other people can look at our lives and, as with biography, compile it, put it together, and tell the world what our lives meant. That meaning and that life story can only be culminated in an ending. And without that ending, we're left with a story that isn't a story, a life that isn't a life, something that's just a meaningless, meandering, plotless morass. So for Audrey and for this novel, the reality and the necessity of death allows us to live meaningful lives. It's only after we die and the life story or our biography is complete that others people can come back, look at our lives, and construct the meaning to it. They can aggregate all the different things that we've done into one cohesive story for them and then present it to others to proclaim who we were, who we are as we live on in memory, and who we will be remembered as.